The Tampa Bay Buccaneers were in a good position in this draft for the primary reason being is they already have their quarterback in Jameis Winston. He's already in the fold. He's already in the mix. So in this year's draft, with several quarterbacks being slated to go high, some other high-level prospects on both sides of the ball, the Bucs sitting at pick 7 were in a really good space because either A, they were going to have a great player fall into their lap, and they'd just be able to take him at number 7 when, for all intents and purposes, in a standard draft, maybe they wouldn't be able to do so, or B, they would be sitting in a position where a team might get antsy and want to jump up to where the Bucs were to get a quarterback. One of those two scenarios was going to play out. Either way, a real power position for the Buccaneers, a really good spot to be in. It really was. And ultimately, as we know, the Buccaneers went down path B. The Bills were antsy to make sure they got up and got their quarterback. The Bucs were looking to deal back once Chubb and Nelson were off the board. So they made a deal happen. They went back from 7 to pick 12, and in the process, picked up 2 second-round picks in this year's draft to move back all of 5 slots, with some studs on the defensive side still on the board at that point, potentially still being there at pick 12. It was really nice work by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers front office, by their general manager, to make that type of deal happen. Not just to get 1 second-round pick, but knowing the Bills were moving up for a quarterback to force them to give up 2 second-round picks this year if they weren't going to give up a first-round pick next year. Really, really good job. I think the real surprise, though, was when the Bucs, who a lot of people, myself included, had slated to take Derwin James at pick 7, traded back to 12, and based off of the way the draft played out, Derwin James, the safety from Florida State, a top 5 player in this draft, in my estimation, was still there, and the Tampa Bay Bucs passed on him. I was surprised. I know I'm not the only one that was surprised. And in particular, initially, Vita Vea over Derwin James was really surprising. Because you're thinking either A, the Bucs want to get better in terms of their pass rush, or B, they want to get better in their secondary. And for all intents and purposes, Vita Vea doesn't really impact either one of those areas. So the initial reaction was kind of shock, at least for me, that you trade back from 7 to 12, the guy I guess a lot of us thought was going to end up in Tampa, is still on the board. It seemed like it was a perfect marriage and set up so well, and then they went in a different direction. But even with that said, just because the Buccaneers went in a different direction doesn't mean that it's a bad direction. Because Vita Vea is going to come in and going to be able to stuff the run. Now you can put him next to Gerald McCoy on rundowns, and it's going to be really, really hard to run up the middle. Vea may have a little bit of pass rush potential. We'll see how well that translates in the NFL. But this is a dude that could be an absolute force in the middle of the line. This is a dude that could completely take away running up the middle of the field. And frankly, the Buccaneers needed to get better on defense, period. Vita is a different way to be able to do that. And still in the process be able to pick up 2 second-round picks while moving down from 7 to 12 and getting Vea feels like still pretty good work. Round 2, I thought this team did really well for themselves. Ronald Jones, Rojo from USC, my number 2 running back in this draft, even ahead of Darius Geis. I love the way this guy runs. He's got 3 down potential. I felt like he was getting slept on just a tad in the process, especially as we got closer to the draft. I was starting to worry that he might drop a little bit in the process. And ultimately, the Buccaneers weren't going to let him go by. Now, if a Nick Chubb was on the board or a Rashard Penny was on the board, would Ronald Jones have been the pick? I don't know. But they chose him over Darius Geis, which I thought was interesting, but I didn't think was bad. Because, again, ultimately, I had a slightly higher grade on Jones than I did Darius Geis. Now you're talking about Jones coming in, having the potential to be a 3-down back for them right away, something that Buccaneers offense desperately, desperately needed. I thought it was good value at that point in time in the draft. And then to be able to go at the tail end of round 2, Get MJ Stewart from North Carolina, Carlton Davis from Auburn, Vernon Hargraves. Your roster spot is on the line here. It's a message sent to him, and in general, just a way to try and get the team better. Carlton Davis being an outside physical press type of corner, who I think could be a long-term starter in the league. And MJ Stewart, he's physical, he's great in the slot. You know, these are two guys I expect to play quite a bit as rookies. So looking even just at the first 2 rounds, moving down from 7 to 12 allowed them to get both MJ Stewart and Carlton Davis. That feels like a huge win. Vita Vea is going to make a difference in the middle of that BUCS defensive line in the running game, if nothing else, and that feels like a win. And then to get Rojo, my number 2 running back in this draft, early on in round 2, get that 3-down back, that potential factor back. I thought it was really good work right then and there. Like, if the BUCS didn't have any more picks, this would be a solid draft for them. But they did have more picks, and they took more players. I like Alex Cappa, not just because he looks like the sloth Flash from Zootopia, but I feel like this is a guy that long-term could start inside at guard for them. In the meantime, provide some offensive line depth, could play multiple positions. Jordan Whitehead had some character concerns, but in the 4th round, he feels like a guy that could potentially be an impact safety for them in the future. If nothing else, at least a starter, better than a Chris Conte, for God's sakes. Justin Watson, the wide receiver from Penn, I think he was getting slept on a little bit in the process. I think he's got a little bit of upside to him. Even Cichy, the linebacker from Wisconsin, might be a valuable role player, backup, special teams type of guy. It's really hard for me to look at this Buccaneers draft and think that they made any major mistakes. Clearly the intention was to get better on the defensive side of the ball. And in the first 4 rounds, they spent 4 picks total on the defensive side of the ball, which is what needed to happen. They didn't totally ignore the offense, though, and where they did address the offense, I thought they addressed it well with Jones and Cappa, 2 guys that I think are future starters for them. So I look at this BUCS draft, and I'm like, I'm very high on Vea. I think he's a long-term starter. I think Ronald Jones is a long-term starter. I think Stewart is a starter as a nickel. I think Carlton Davis is an eventual number 2 corner on the outside. So, for all intents and purposes, right there, that's 4 starters. Cappa at some point could be a 5th starter. Whitehead might even sneak up and surprise you a little bit and be the 6th one. This team may have very well have gotten 6 starters in this draft. Usually when you look at a draft, you say, if 2 guys panned out and are with the team in 5 years, that's an okay draft. 3 players, pretty good. 4 or more is borderline outstanding. To me, I look at this draft and see where the BUCS could have potentially gotten 6 of them. They are a team that I thought did very well for themselves on draft weekend. And I think in part because they took Vita Vea over Derwin James or even a Tremaine Edmonds, more people aren't giving them the credit that I feel like they kind of deserve.